Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment, as we're taking a look, of course, at the 13th Vice President of the United States, William Rufus King. I hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday. Of course, part 1, we went over the early life and time as a senator in the Senate for William Rufus King. And now part 2, of course, we're going to be talking about his vice presidency, his death, his untimely death, I should add, his interesting relationship with James Buchanan, and all that sort of thing. And we're even going to have some very cool bonus footage, very special guest that we're going to be speaking to in the bonus footage. So all of that will be here in part 2. So let's just get right into it and start off here talking first about the vice presidential ambitions of William Rufus King. So here we go. In the late 1830s, as a leading Southern moderate among long-serving middle-aged senators, William King attracted attention within the Democratic Party as a prospective vice presidential candidate for the 1840 election. As early as 1838, dissatisfaction with Vice President Richard M. Johnson for his negative impact on the 1836 race and his scandalous personal life caused party leaders to begin the search for a strong second-term running mate for President Martin Van Buren. King was a natural contender, having been on the national political stage for a quarter century and having routinely substituted for Johnson during the vice president's frequent absences from the Senate chamber. He enjoyed significant support in the electorally important state of Pennsylvania, thanks to his roommate and close ally, Senator James Buchanan. Buchanan wished to thwart the 1844 presidential ambitions of both Senator Thomas Hart Benton and Secretary of State John Forsyth by blocking their paths to the vice presidency in 1840. In the closeness of their relationship in the years after 1834, King and Buchanan, both lifelong bachelors, became known as the Siamese Twins. King assured Buchanan that in return for the Pennsylvania's help in obtaining the vice presidency in 1840, he would refuse to run for the presidency in 1844, thus clearing the way for Buchanan. The Pennsylvania senator agreed to King's plan and circulated his name among leading Democratic newspaper editors. The anticipated renomination of President Van Buren, a New Yorker, required balancing by a Southerner such as King. By the start of 1840, however, King's vice presidential chances had evaporated because he was unable to generate support from Democratic leaders in the influential states of North Carolina and Pennsylvania. At the party's national convention in Baltimore, a motion to give the second spot to King failed to draw serious interest, and party leaders decided to leave the vice presidential selection to the individual state party organizations. In 1842, King's name again surfaced as a vice presidential contender for the 1844 Democratic ticket. Supporters of a presidential bid by South Carolina's John C. Calhoun tried without success to dissuade King, as there would be room for no more than one Southerner on a national slate. But by late 1843, the stronger candidacy of former President Van Buren smothered Calhoun's aspirations. For Van Buren's running mate, the names most frequently mentioned were James K. Polk and William King. King's supporters argued that, as a Jacksonian and resident of a southern state loyal to the Democratic Party, a slap at Polk's Whig-inclined Tennessee, he deserved the vice presidency. However, in a repeat of his troubles 4 years earlier, King was unable to attract serious support in the electorally rich eastern states. so that his candidacy had lost its vitality by the eve of the 1844 Baltimore Convention. Meanwhile, Van Buren had destroyed his own chances of becoming the presidential nominee with his announcement of opposition to the annexation of Texas. King hoped that party leaders would fill that void by selecting Buchanan, in which case he would again offer himself for the second spot on the grounds that his presence would help secure essential electoral votes from the wavering state of North Carolina. On April 9th of 1844, President Tyler ended King's pre-convention maneuvering by appointing him minister to France. Throughout 1843 and into early 1844, angry with Tyler's policies, the Senate had rejected many of his nominations to major judicial, cabinet, and diplomatic posts. Among these was the appointment as minister to France of Virginia Representative Henry A. Wise, described by a modern historian as a high-strung, tobacco-chewing extrovert. As a result, this sensitive post had remained vacant for 18 months until Tyler selected King, one of the Senate's most popular members. Easily confirmed, King left for Paris and soon succeeded in his central mission to keep France from interfering with U.S. plans to annex Texas. From Paris, King kept actively in touch with national and Alabama political developments. In April of 1846, he wrote his friend James Buchanan, now his boss as Secretary of State, "Most sincerely do I wish that we had both remained in the Senate." King therefore decided to run for his old Senate seat, then occupied by political rival and fellow Democrat Dixon H. Lewis. Desiring to return in time to influence the Alabama legislature's election, he left for the United States in November 1846. In a three-way race that included Whig leader Arthur Hopkins, the legislature took 17 ballots during December 1847, but failed to make a selection. Throughout this hotly contested battle between Unionist and states' rights forces, a battle that one modern historian of Alabama labeled probably the most significant senatorial election in the antebellum period, states' rights candidate Lewis led, followed by Hopkins and then Unionist King. On the 18th ballot, in the only election defeat of his public career, King withdrew and the seat went to Lewis. King, however, did not have to wait long to fulfill his senatorial ambitions. Within 7 months, Alabama's other Senate seat became vacant when President Polk named Arthur Bagby minister to Russia. On July 1st of 1848, the governor appointed King to fill the 8 months remaining in Bagby's term. Later that year, in a close race with his nemesis Arthur Hopkins, King won a full term. Now a little bit more about King and him being a pretty good compromiser, especially in 1850. Here, I'm going to explain this to you. The national mood had darkened during King's 4-year absence from the Senate. He told James Buchanan that he had doubts about the wisdom of returning in those troubled days. A seat in the Senate is, I assure you, far from being desirable to me, bringing with it, as it does at this particular time especially, great responsibility, great labor, and no little anxiety. Characteristically, King tried to calm the brewing storm. He urged Northern senators to resist intensifying pressures to introduce anti-slavery petitions. I speak as a senator who has been here many years and as one always anxious to see the members of this body preserve that decorum and kindness toward each other which secures to the body the respect in which it is held throughout the country and the world. He supported the spirit if not always, the specifics of Henry Clay's compromise measures. He opposed admitting California without the seasoning period of territorial status, and he believed that Congress had about as much constitutional power to prohibit slavery from going into the territories of the United States as we have power to pass an act carrying slavery there. He believed that abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia would be unfair to the slaveholders in adjacent states, but he supported abolition of the slave trade there. As the regional positions hardened in the tumultuous early months of 1850, William Rufus King lamented the baneful spirit of party that in dividing the South encouraged Northern extremists. In April, King's seniority and moderate views earned him a place as one of 2 Southern Democratic representatives on the Senate Select Committee of 13, appointed to review Henry Clay's compromise resolutions regarding territories and slavery. With a majority of the committee's members, he agreed that slavery was a rightful subject for legislative attention, but only in the legislatures of states and not of territories. Thus, King took the view of Southern conservatives that the Constitution protected owners in their control of slave property until a territory became a state. At home, he met bitter opposition from a faction of Southern rights secessionists who argued that his voting record better reflected the interests of Massachusetts, but an equally large group of supporters praised his support for compromise, union, and peace. He counseled patience, optimistically expecting the North to respect Southern rights, but warning that if that section's actions jeopardized those rights, both constitutional and material, all Southern men should hurl defiance at the fanatical crew and unitedly determine to defend their rights at every hazard and every sacrifice. Oh boy. So he was a compromiser in 1850, but not exactly on the right side of things. He definitely was for slave owners' rights. He kind of defended, obviously, slavery. He defended, especially in the southern states, the rights of slave holders to own enslaved people. Obviously terrible stuff, but it is the truth and the reality of it. The only thing that King was against, he said that basically they didn't have the right to vote on or pass legislation in territories that were then, at the time, not yet states. But he felt that if it was already a state, that the legislation should be passed to defend slaveholders' rights. Pretty not a good thing. Pretty big blemish as far as I'm concerned. When it comes to William Rufus King. But again, you're talking about a southern guy who was living in Alabama. His family were slave owners, so he came from a long line of slave owners, slaveholders. So this is not exactly a shocking thing to hear, of course. So now moving on, a bit more about some time in the Senate and some things that he did. An arbiter of decorum. The Senate chamber in 1850 was frequently jammed to capacity as the major debates on slavery in the territories drew large crowds of House members, reporters, and the general public eager to get a glimpse of the likes of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Thomas Hart Benton, Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, Sam Houston of Texas, and others of the nation's most notable public figures. As a frequent presiding officer, William Rufus King regularly acted to restore decorum. In this electrically charged environment, he took every opportunity to remind other senators of his need for their support, to put down the least movement toward disorder or the slightest indulgence in personal remarks. In May, while Vice President Millard Fillmore was presiding, a senator won adoption of a routine resolution to admit a local newspaper reporter to the Senate floor. Dissatisfied with such flagrant circumvention of the Senate's floor access rules, another member suggested referring the matter to a committee. Several senators proposed that the presiding officer be allowed to issue each member one admission permit to a ward as he saw fit. According to the proposal, with a guest waiting at the chamber's entrance, the host senator would go to the dais and request his ticket from the vice president. New Jersey Senator William Dayton predicted there would be few takers. All the multitudinous persons who hang around the Capitol will not have the face to ask senators to go to the vice president and formally get the permit to allow them to come on the floor every day. Others laughed at the dilemma of a senator having to decide between male and female guests and the idea of such a system that would have 60 senatorial guests contending with 60 senators and several hundred House members for floor space in such a cramped quarters. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi sounded the most realistic note. It is utterly impossible to attempt to admit all who desire to come on the floor. The evil can only be remedied by an enlarged chamber. As the member most identified with Senate decorum and tradition, William Rufus King brought the debate to a close by moving to refer the matter to a special committee, knowing that another committee would soon propose the construction of new Senate and House chambers, each with ample public galleries. Pretty interesting stuff. This is all, to me, it's quite interesting. King, his time in the Senate, and of course, this is really during a very, very tumultuous time in our history. Slavery being, the big issue and topic. And this, being 1850, as we're kind of at that time period right now, what we're speaking about, this is literally right before, not far long before Civil War. So, very interesting stuff. So now we're going to talk finally about his vice presidency, and then get into his death and that sort of thing. So here we go. On July 10th of 1850, Zachary Taylor's death placed Millard Fillmore in the White House and left the vice presidency vacant. On July 11th, the solemn Senate set aside the practice of having each party offer a nomination for the president pro tempore's post and unanimously selected King for the vacancy. This otherwise routine act took on special significance, for King would be in effect the acting Vice President of the United States. King addressed the Senate in the tone of a Vice President offering an inaugural oration. Noting the unusual bipartisan support for his election, noting the unusual bipartisan support for his election, King vowed to enforce the Senate's rules, mildly but firmly, and I trust impartially. Should I err, I look to my brother senators in a spirit of kindness to correct my errors. Continuing in the fashion of former Vice President Fillmore, King worked hard to calm the angry seas that swelled with increasing violence on the Senate floor. King's long quest for the vice presidency had resumed immediately after he returned from France in 1846. However, his failure that year to regain in his Senate seat, coupled with deep ideologic divisions within the Alabama Democratic Party, denied him the support necessary to launch a vigorous national campaign. At the 1848 National Convention in Baltimore, following the nomination of Michigan's Lewis Cass for the presidency, King's was among a half-dozen names placed before the delegates. On the first ballot, he came in third. On the second ballot, the convention selected Kentucky's General William O. Butler, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican War. In January of 1852, the Alabama State Democratic Convention endorsed the Compromise of 1850 and directed the state's National Convention delegates to support King for either the presidency or vice presidency. At the jam-packed, tumultuous Baltimore Convention, delegates selected Franklin Pierce on the 49th ballot. In a peace gesture to the Buchanan wing of the party, Pierce's supporters allowed Buchanan's allies to fill the second position, knowing that they would select King. On the second ballot, with only minor opposition, William Rufus King finally captured his prize. During the ensuing campaign, King's tuberculosis, which he believed he had contracted while in Paris, denied him the active, behind-the-scenes role that he might otherwise have played. Although he worked hard to assure his region's voters that New Hampshire's Pierce was a Northern man with Southern principles. King's deteriorating physical condition clouded the victory that came in November. Pierce's unwillingness to consult the vice president-elect on cabinet appointments deepened his malaise. In November, William Rufus Devane King began to suffer from a worsening cough. A month later, he described himself as looking like a skeleton and told friends he doubted that he would ever recover. On December 20th, 2 weeks into the short December-March congressional session, King resigned his Senate seat and made plans to regain his health away from wintertime Washington. On January 17th of 1853, William Rufus King left for the more salutary climate of Cuba. By way of Key West, Florida, he reached Havana in early February. Soon realizing that he would be unable to return to Washington in time for the March 4th, 1853 inauguration, William Rufus King requested that Congress permit him to take his oath in Cuba. Consequently, for the only time in this nation's history, Congress passed legislation allowing the vice president-elect to be sworn in outside the country. On March 24th of 1853, near Matanzas, a seaport town 60 miles east of Havana, Cuba, the gravely ill statesman, too feeble to stand unaided, became the nation's 13th vice president. Deciding that he would make every effort to return to the United States, King set sail for Mobile on April 6th. He reached his Alabama plantation on April 17th, but his struggle was at an end. The 67-year-old King died there the following day. An opposition newspaper praised his purity and patriotism and concluded, though not perhaps brilliant, he was better, sensible, honest, never running into ultrarism. But in the contest between the state and the federal government, maintaining the true conservative medium, so necessary to the preservation of the Constitution, the rights of the states, and the Republic. And also the correct pronunciation of the town where he took his oath of vice presidency is Matanzas. It is Matanzas, Cuba, which is, just wanted to correct myself. Like I said, it's a seaport town 60 miles east of Havana, Cuba. So there you go. That's kind of the life and the legacy and that sort of thing of William Rufus King. Really interesting stuff, because the interesting thing is several things. Of course, we know Very interestingly, about the fact that he's the only vice president or president, anybody like that, to be sworn in on foreign soil. I find that fascinating, of course. And the fact of how short his vice presidency really was. Henry and I had made the mistake and said, I think we said 50 days or something like that in our opening. However, the truth of the matter is, it was actually a total of 45 days. It was from March 4th to April 18th was the exact time frame. So March 4th of 1853 to April 18th of 1853. He died 1 month and 14 days into his term. So very short-lived. I do want to read a little bit about the relationship with James Buchanan. So I will read that now. The argument for King's homosexuality has been put forward by a biographer, Gene Baker. It has been supported by Shelley Ross, James W. Lowen, and Robert P. Watson. It focuses essentially on his close and intimate relationship with President James Buchanan. The two men lived together for 13 years, from 1840 until King's death in 1853. Buchanan referred to the relationship as a communion, and the two often attended official functions together. Contemporaries also noted and commented upon the unusual closeness. Andrew Jackson mockingly called them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, the former being a 19th century euphemism for an effeminate man, while Aaron V. Brown referred to King as Buchanan's better half. However, the historian Louis Somm has pointed out customs and expressions were different in the mid-1800s than they are today. Miss Nancy was a fairly common designation for people who wore clean clothes and had good manners. He also noted that Aaron Brown was a political enemy of King. Lowen has described Buchanan and King as Siamese twins. Sol Barsman, a biographer of vice presidents, wrote that King's fastidious habits and conspicuous intimacy with the bachelor Buchanan gave rise to some cruel jibes. Buchanan adopted King's mannerisms and romanticized view of Southern culture. Both had strong political ambitions, and in 1844, they planned to run as president and vice president. Both men were soft, effeminate, and eccentric. They spent some time apart while King was on overseas missions in France, and their letters remain cryptic and avoid revealing any personal feelings at all. In May of 1844, Buchanan wrote to Cornelia Roosevelt, "I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I have gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any of them. I feel that it is not good for man to be alone, and I should not be astonished to find myself married to some old maid who can nurse me when I am sick, provide good dinners for me when I am well, and not expect from me any very ardent or romantic affection." After King died in 1853, James Buchanan described him as among the best, the purest, and most consistent public men I have known. Baker concluded that while some of their correspondence was destroyed by family members, the length and the intimacy of surviving letters illustrate the affection of a special friendship between King and Buchanan, with no way to know for certain whether it was a romantic relationship. So I will tell you guys now that part of our bonus footage here for part 2 is going to be a wonderful interview. I've had this man on several times on my channel. Him and I have done some grading of presidents, and we've talked about his book on my channel. And I'm going to be sitting down and having an interview with the wonderful Thomas Balcerski, who is the author of the wonderful book, Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King. So we're going to be talking to Thomas Balcerski all about this relationship And, of course, we're going to be asking him, since he researched it so well, we're going to be asking him about William Rufus King and some interesting facts and things that Thomas Balcerski will be able to share with us regarding the friendship and relationship of James Buchanan and King, and then, of course, just about King himself. So that's going to be really cool. That's going to be here in the bonus footage at the end of this part 2. So stay tuned for that. A little bit more about King and vice presidency and death. The 1852 Democratic National Convention was held at the 1851 Maryland Institute for the Promotion of the Mechanic Arts Hall in Baltimore. Franklin Pierce was nominated for president, and King was nominated for vice president. Pierce and King defeated the Whig candidates Winfield Scott and William Alexander Graham. While attending college, King and Graham had been members of rival campus organizations in Chapel Hill, King belonging to the Philanthropic Society and Graham to the Dialectic Society. Because King was ill with tuberculosis and had traveled to Cuba in an effort to regain his health, he was not able to be in Washington to take his oath of office on March 4th of 1853. By a special act of Congress passed on March 2nd, he was allowed to take the oath of office outside of the United States and was sworn in on March 24th of 1853 near Matanzas, Cuba, by the U.S. Consul to Cuba, William L. Sharkey, is who swore him in. King is the first and to date the only vice president of the United States to take the oath of office on foreign soil. Shortly afterward, King made the journey to return to Chestnut Hill, his plantation. He died within 2 days of his arrival on April 18th of 1853 at age of 67 of tuberculosis. He was originally interred in a vault on the plantation, and later he was reburied in Selma, Alabama's Old Live Oak Cemetery. King never carried out any duties of the office. Following King's death, the office of vice president was vacant until John C. Breckinridge was inaugurated by President James Buchanan in 1857. Very interesting stuff. So yes, he was originally buried at Chestnut Hill, his plantation. That has since burned down. When I visited down there in Selma, Alabama, you can't even, there's nothing to go see. There's not like a building to go see that still stands. As a matter of fact, I want to say it's even a lumber yard now in present day. I believe that it's some sort of like lumber manufacturer down there in Selma, Alabama. They own the property where Chestnut Hill once stood, and it's private business. It's a private business owned property, and there's nothing back there anyway. So not even his original tomb. There's nothing to go see as far as that goes. A little bit about his legacy. In 1852, the Oregon territorial legislature named King County for him. King County became part of Washington Territory when it was created the following year, and then part of the state of Washington in 1889. In 1985, the King County government amended its designation and its logo to honor instead the late National Civil Rights Movement leader, Martin Luther King Jr. The change was made official on April 19th of 2005 when Governor Christine Gregory signed into law Senate Bill 5332, effective July 24th of 2005. The King Residence Quadrangle at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, his alma mater, is named for him. An 1830 portrait of King is held at New East Hall in the philanthropic chambers of the Dialectic and Philanthropic Societies, a debating society which he had joined during college. King was a co-founder of and named Selma, a town on the Alabama River, which he named after the Ossianic poem, The Songs of Selma. After his death, city officials and some of King's family wanted to move his body to Selma. Other family members wanted his body to remain at Chestnut Hill, his plantation. In 1882, the Selma City Council appointed a committee to select a new plot for King's body. His remains were then reinterred in the city's Live Oak Cemetery under a white marble mausoleum erected by the city. And there you have it. And you're seeing a couple photos of that mausoleum at the Live Oak Cemetery in Selma, Alabama. Keep in mind, actually, one of my favorite grave sites I've ever visited for a president or vice president. This is in my top 5 to 8, probably 5 to 8 favorites. I just loved it. It's got a lot of southern feel to it, a lot of southern charm with the Spanish moss and everything hanging off the trees, and it's just a very cool, very cool little mausoleum. I really enjoyed it. So, there you have it, guys. The life, legacy, vice presidency, short-lived, and the untimely death of William Rufus Devane King. Stay tuned, of course. Bonus footage. I'm going to show you all my photos from my visit to his gravesite down there in Selma, Alabama. And we're going to have a wonderful interview with Dr. Thomas Balcerski, who's going to tell us all about the relationship between James Buchanan and William Rufus King and give us some really fun, interesting facts about William Rufus King himself. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, guys, for all the support, all the love. We really appreciate it. Can't thank you guys enough. This has just been a really fantastic, fun ride for us. And stay tuned, of course, for that bonus footage. And then next week, we're back to it. Our next vice president of this vice presidential series, which is actually going to be John C. Breckinridge. So stay tuned for that next week. Thanks again. Keep all the comments and questions coming. Everything. We love it. Even if it's something that you have a gripe or a beef with when it comes to things we do, please let us know. I want to know everything. This is open discussion here with ourselves and, of course, you guys, our wonderful subscribers. So thanks so much for everything, and stay tuned. Also, if you're watching this, hopefully on Friday, don't forget this Friday, November 12th, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, November 12th, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a special live stream right here on our YouTube channel with the wonderful author, Louis Picone, the author of The President is Dead. So stay tuned for that. Really excited for that. All right, guys, thanks so much. We will see you next week. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, of course, and I am joined by a very special guest, Dr. Thomas Balserski, who has been on my channel a few times now. He's almost becoming a regular on here, which is very cool. And just for you that don't know who Thomas Balserski is, he is an associate professor of history at Eastern Connecticut State University. He's also he's a scholar of early American history, and he is the author, of course, of Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King. And, of course, he is a brilliant, wonderful guest, always so gracious to come on. And, Thomas, thank you for being here, and thank you for taking some time today on short notice to discuss our 13th Vice President of the United States, William Rufus King, with us.
Well, thanks for having me back, TJ.
Oh, absolutely. So, of course, as I just stated, you wrote a book all about this very interesting relationship between James Buchanan and William Rufus King. I wanted to have you on because, of course, my video this week is centered around William Rufus King. Of course, a man who had a very, very short-lived vice presidency, as you're well aware. So I wanted to just kind of get some inside information. I know you researched this for a very long time, and I wanted to kind of get your opinion and kind of just some fun facts. Why don't we start there with the relationship between James Buchanan and William Rufus King? What's some interesting things you could tell us about the relationship between the two men?
Yeah, so William Rufus King, just to start off, is at the time he meets James Buchanan, an Alabama senator. And he had been in the Senate at that point for already 15 years. So he was already pretty well established. He was at the height of his sort of political powers. And so too was the party he was a part of, the Democratic Party, the party of Andrew Jackson. So when Buchanan and King met, it was the year 1834. In Jackson's second term, the Democrats were in control of the White House and both houses of Congress. Buchanan was elected to the Senate from Pennsylvania. He had already been in Congress before in the House of Representatives. And so now you have two senators, one from Pennsylvania, one from Alabama, meeting, and they quickly seem to hit it off, we might say. They are both, of course, from the same party, but they are so connected on another level that they decide to live together in Washington while they're in Congress. And that other level is the fact that both men were bachelors, and both middle-aged bachelors, both political bachelors at that point. Mm-hmm. So this relationship between Buchanan and King grows out of a boarding house situation in Washington, D.C. And for the remainder of King's life, he dies in 1853. Buchanan is his closest political ally within the northern wing of the Democratic Party. And I think it's important to point out that King is a Southerner, a moderate Southerner by the standards of the day. And it's really that connection to the northern wing of the party that enables King to rise as far as he does to become the 13th vice president.
Very interesting. Now, Thomas, I know, for as far as like Franklin Pierce is concerned, now Franklin Pierce was the president in which William Rufus King served as vice president, of course. And Franklin Pierce is obviously well known as being kind of a northerner who had Southern sympathies, so to speak, especially, when it came to slavery and issues such as that. Now, was James Buchanan, being a northerner, being from Pennsylvania, did he have similar views to Pierce, where he was a northerner with Southern sympathies? Would you put them in the same kind of category, or not so much?
Yeah, that phrase, a northerner with Southern principles or sympathies, was actually a derogatory one. It was used by political enemies to dismiss people like Franklin Pierce and eventually James Buchanan. And another insult really that was used for such people was doughface.
Doughface, yeah.
And that had come earlier. It probably came from John Randolph of Virginia, was probably the first one to coin the phrase in a different context. But it kind of caught on as a term for really a Northern Democrat mostly, who aligned himself with the Southern wing of the party for political reasons. So historians will refer to both Pierce and Buchanan as doughfaces, these two presidents of the 1850s. It's interesting, though, that Pierce and Buchanan came to their doughface principles by different routes. Now, both Pierce and Buchanan served in the Senate. In fact, they were in the Senate at the same time. But with Buchanan, it was really his relationship to King that set into motion his doughface principles. Prior to that, he hadn't really shown the kind of submission, we might say, to the South that he would later do in his political career. But I think it was the association with King in the boarding house, as well as other Southerners, that brought him to that point. I think for Pierce, incidentally, it had a lot to do with his service during the Mexican-American War, when he came into contact with numerous Southern officers. In fact, that war was sort of overpopulated, disproportionately led by Southern officers. And one of Pierce's closest friends, believe it or not, from his time during the Mexican-American War was Jefferson Davis, who will go on to be a senator from Mississippi, his Secretary of War, and eventually during the Civil War, the president of the Confederacy.
Yes, very interesting stuff. It's interesting. What I found interesting about King, obviously doing a little bit more research on my end about King, obviously he came from, a fairly well-to-do family, and they were fairly large slaveholders and slave owners down there in the South. Now, King himself, when he built his plantation there down in Alabama, now was he a very big slave holder and slave owner himself, or did he at all change his views on slavery? I know he was very adamant against Southern states' rights for slavery, but was it anything that he changed his view on in any way, shape, or form toward the end of his life? I know his life ended pretty abruptly and early, but Was it anything that he did change his views on before he died?
I think King's relation to slavery is critical because it will define his personal life, and it will ultimately define his political life. As slavery as an institution in the time of William Rufus King was everywhere. When he was born in 1786, slavery was illegal and practiced in all 13 of then the states, the new United States of America under the Articles of Confederation. And eventually, as the Constitution comes into place, slavery is discussed, debated, and compromised in the very debates that lead to the formation of the Constitution. So by the time Buchanan's born in 1791, Pennsylvania is a slaveholding state. Alabama is a slaveholding state. The key difference is, well, I should say not Alabama, North Carolina. I wanted to say that King is born in North Carolina and moves to Alabama. But North Carolina and Pennsylvania had that in common. Now, fast forward to the point when the two of them are in Congress together, and the two states have gone a very different path. Pennsylvania has enacted the manumission law, which will eventually lead to the full abolition of slavery, whereas North Carolina has not only kept slavery, but it has actually grown the institution by sending people like William Rufus King, its sons and daughters, to states farther west in what is now, we call it the Southeast, but they called the Southwest. I mean, after all, the state of Alabama was basically founded by migrants, by settlers from North Carolina and Georgia who went west to settle the land to grow cotton. And cotton and the Cotton Kingdom was the whole reason economically that brought people to the new territory of Alabama and as well as Mississippi. So when King moves to Alabama in 1819, he's really just following the path of so many from North Carolina and Georgia who were making that migration. The big difference, I think, with William Rufus King and how he sort of conceives of slavery as an institution is he saw it as a means to an end. I mean, on the one hand, he was a cotton planter. He had a plantation called King's Bend, just outside of what is today the town of Selma, Alabama. He probably at one point had as many as 400 slaves, although it was divided among different family members as well. He grew cotton. He sold it to market, and it was really what gave him the financial well-being to go and pursue his political career. And that's the point I want to make, is that politics was always William Rufus King's primary avocation. From the time he started to run for the state legislature in North Carolina to the time he went and served in the U.S. House of Representatives in North Carolina, to his many foreign missions. Basically, that was his career, but it was always supported financially by the institution of slavery. And among King's papers, among what survives from the records in Alabama and North Carolina, are evidences of the kind of plantation life. We don't have too much information. We have some of the names of the enslaved at King's Bend. We have some of his family members, some of the people who were running the plantation. And there's a wonderful plot graph that shows the various plots that form the plantation. But it's really hard to say what sort of he felt about it on a kind of moral level. King was a moderate, meaning he never advanced any kind of sort of more radical pro-slavery arguments. You won't find speeches, too many speeches anyway, from King where he's expounding the virtues of slavery. That being said, he was not going to allow anyone to go the other way and tell him that slavery was in some ways unsanctioned by the Bible or immoral, or any number of the abolitionist arguments that were emerging during the same period. And if there's one thing that Buchanan and King did have in common around the institution of slavery, is they hated the opponents of slavery with a passion, the abolitionists. And it was really that sort of shared hatred towards their political enemies that brought them together, especially at the critical moments of presidential elections.
Well, that's fascinating. It's fascinating that both King and Buchanan had such a disdain for abolitionists of the time and such. That's interesting. Now, going backward a little bit in King's life, I know he didn't actually finish his schooling. He did drop out. So I want to ask you about that and to touch on that. And also, I know Buchanan was very heavily involved with a woman who he was actually engaged to at one point. Was William Rufus King ever, seriously involved in any sort of intimate relationship with a woman that just didn't work out? Why don't you touch on those two things for us, please?
Well, certainly. I mentioned that Buchanan and King shared bachelorhood as one of the key identifiers. And I should say that King is not the only bachelor vice president. I'm sure you'll be covering that during your series, nor was he, totally uncommon for the period. I mentioned that Buchanan and King sought each other out, as did other senators and representatives in Washington, because they were unmarried. But the thing that sort of these 19th century bachelors tended to have in common, besides not being married, was at least an attempt towards marriage. Now, King's story, his sort of story of a long ago romance, by comparison to Buchanan's, is a bit more far-fetched. Buchanan actually was engaged to Anne Coleman of Lancaster. They had a documentable and documented courtship. The engagement was broken for reasons that seemed to have to do with Buchanan ignoring her in favor of his work. And she ultimately and unexpectedly died in Philadelphia, probably of a drug overdose in December 1819. Now, William Rufus King, by contrast, again, doesn't marry in his early years. No, he does drop out of college. You pointed that out. So he's sort of an eligible bachelor in North Carolina. He goes into politics. He's in Washington, D.C. as a congressman during the 1800s, 1810s. And it's going to be after the War of 1812, after the devastation to the capital, that he decides to give up his seat in Congress and seek a foreign mission. So he's now into his middle 30s, still unmarried, and he goes over as Secretary of Legation, which you might say is something of a downgrade from being a U.S. House of Representatives member. But I think it gave him a chance to go overseas, to see the world, and to kind of break the rut that being in this wartime Washington had produced. So it's in this capacity, first as Secretary of the Legation, meaning not even the sort of the head, but sort of the kind of chief assistant to whoever was leading the negotiations in Naples. This is before the unification of Italy. But his mission is actually transferred from Naples to Russia. So he goes to Russia, to St. Petersburg, which was then the capital of the Russian imperial throne. And he is part of sort of then the American legation, and is as he would is expected to attend various court events, including marriages. Now, the Russian emperor, or Tsar as it was called at the time, had a son named Nicholas. And Nicholas, who would be heir to the throne, not yet the new Tsar, was married, which again would be expected and required of any imperial dynasty. This is the case of across Europe, Asia, and the world, frankly. That's how dynasties and successions work. And also, which was common at the time, his bride was not Russian. She was brought in from another country. This was often purposeful to unite kind of the royalty of Europe, and her name was Princess Charlotte of Prussia, which is a principality which will eventually become Germany. So it's sort of uniting Germany and Russia in a royal marriage. And Charlotte, who comes over to marry Nicholas at the court, is therefore this great beauty and belle, and is sort of the most spectacular woman entering into the court of that moment. And at the marriage, therefore, it was as a customary, there's a receiving line, and King, part of the American delegation, is there. And supposedly he, as was common, to kiss the hand of the bride, he does it passionately, as in he probably holds it longer than he might have. And this was noticed. Now, what does this mean? I mean, is it just a faux pas? Is it just something you laugh off? No. I mean, supposedly this means that he had committed some great injustice. And I mean, the worry was that this could get him in hot water, even put him into jail. Now, this is all circumstantial evidence, I want to say. I'm sort of spinning the yarn the way William Rufus King did, because King would talk about this for the rest of his life. He would always talk about some beauty or some love in St. Petersburg that he left behind. And it survives among the oral history of the King family descendants. The real problem is that this is completely just far-fetched. I mean, it's so unbelievable to me as a historian and to a modern day observer that I have to think that he made the whole thing up, or at least he embellished details of it to the point where he used it as an excuse to not have to pursue any form of romantic relationship with women. And that's why I say I don't really buy it. And I don't think that King ever had an interest in women. I don't think he was ever sexually attracted to women. And we find it all throughout his life that he keeps sort of making excuses to his relatives, particularly his nieces and nephews, why he never married and why he never would.
That is so interesting. That's a very interesting observation by you as well. So, you feel that, if King was possibly more sexually attracted and intimately attracted to men,
right,
he tried to hide it for the most of his adult life by making up stories such as this possibly and avoiding the subject, so to speak. That's very, very interesting. Never heard that. That's quite fascinating. So now, could you talk a little bit about King's time overseas? I know he spent some time in Paris too as well. Now I know he died of tuberculosis. Throughout all your research,
right,
is there any real good general idea of how he possibly contracted the tuberculosis? So if you could maybe touch on those things.
Right. So William Rufus King will, return to the Senate. Actually, so the whole thing is after he's coming back from Russia, he then and his family, that's where they relocate from North Carolina, Alabama. He's elected as the very first U.S. Senator from Alabama in 1819. He will serve in the U.S. Senate consecutively between 1819 and 1844, which makes him the longest serving senator. He'll be president pro tempore at several points, meaning he's sort of presiding over the Senate in the place of a vice president, which is important. I'm sure we'll get to when we talk about why he's chosen vice president. But in 1844, there's a very interesting situation that forces him really and pushes him to leave the Senate and to leave Buchanan in the process. President John Tyler, who himself was a vice president under William Henry Harrison, had become a Whig, therefore an opposition party to Jackson and Van Buren, really for personal reasons. His politics had always been Democratic. And therefore, when the Whigs were seeking a vice presidential candidate in 1840, they wanted to bring in sort of a former Democrat who would then balance the ticket politically. So Harrison and Tyler, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, are elected. When Harrison dies in 1841, suddenly you now have really a former Democrat as president. And John Tyler takes it upon himself to bring Democrats into his administration and to make appointments for Democrats. So this brings us to William Rufus King. I mean, really, William Rufus King should not have gotten an appointment from a supposedly Whig administration. But in 1844, when the position of minister to France is open, Tyler turns eventually to King after his first, by the way, appointment is rejected by the Senate because he knows that King would be an acceptable choice. So here it is, this nominally Whig administration picking a Democrat to then be a minister. That doesn't happen. And it really goes in the face of the patronage politics of the day. But it puts William Rufus King in a very important position because France and England were sort of the two major powers of the period. And the United States had its ups and downs with both countries from the first presidency of George Washington all the way through the Civil War until we finally settle into a kind of alliance situation with both nations that will lead us really to be there for them both during World War I and World War II. But in 1844, the issue of the Mexican, really Texas, and therefore what will become the Mexican-American War is about to burst. And France, which had an interest, always held an interest in Mexico and will later try to really control Mexico through the installation of a puppet emperor, didn't want the United States to have kind of full claim to Texas and stood in the way potentially of that claim. So King's mission was nothing short of clearing the path for the United States to make its full claim to Mexico, which it will do eventually under the Polk administration. So King is there for 2 years at the court of Louis Napoleon, this elected emperor of France. And he's dealing with the French foreign minister, Guizot, and he's dealing with all the dignitaries. And he turns out he actually has an important personal connection to the French ministry in that William Rufus Devane King was of French Huguenot ancestry, meaning that part of his line, his maternal line, the Devanes, were French. And he could actually trace some of his relatives to some of the very same people he was interfacing with in France. He spoke French. He understood French. So, I mean, he really was the right fit, sort of almost Francophile fit to be there at that moment. And, there's actually some surviving artifacts from his time in France. He brings back a silver set, which some of this survives in the Alabama State Department of Archives and History and Museum. There's a William Rufus King room, and there's some of the sort of the most finest pieces there are from his time in Paris. So that's where he kind of makes his mark as a diplomat. As far as the tuberculosis, I don't think he contracted it abroad, but honestly, today we're so fortunate with vaccines, particularly in this moment of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we've always been fortunate to have vaccines. We just we've been taking it for granted. One of the shots you get as a kid is for TB. It's one of those 4 shots you get in your second year. And we're just like, I think we're just so blessed to have it, because tuberculosis was one of the great killers of the 19th centuries. And it took not just King, but so many Americans. One of the signs that you had tuberculosis was a cough that eventually would produce blood. And it was a slow, lingering disease. It didn't take you right away, but there was no cure for it. And he sought cures, and that's what's interesting about his vice presidency for the remainder of his life, to try to get some alleviation in his lungs. But it was a pulmonary disease, and it eventually wasted away your ability to breathe, and it was fatal.
Yeah. Interesting. So now let's touch on, before we wrap things up with you today, let's touch on his vice presidency, of course. I know for at least what I researched, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pierce basically left it up to other people to pick his running mate. He wasn't exactly, he wasn't against King, of course. He thought he would be a good choice, but what made King become the vice presidential nominee? And then, of course, regarding the tuberculosis, of course, he was seeking treatment in Cuba at the time, when he was actually going to become and be sworn in as vice president, and becoming the only vice president to be sworn in on foreign soil. So why don't we kind of touch on all of his vice presidency and the events surrounding that?
Well, William Rufus King was kind of a perennial candidate for vice president. He was first considered seriously in 1844 as a running mate to Martin Van Buren, again, to balance the ticket. So the key was, if a Northerner was selected for the presidential candidate, then it would have to be a Southerner for the vice presidential. So 1848, we get Lewis Cass, but this time they choose William O. Butler. They don't win in that election. And that leads us to 1852. Now, Buchanan, this whole time, is hoping to be the nominee, and he's hoping that this connection to King would make for what some people called a bachelor ticket. But in the 1852 nominee convention, it's clear that neither Buchanan nor Stephen Douglas, another leading candidate, will have the votes, the 2/3 votes necessary, which was the requirement at the time. So Franklin Pierce emerges as a dark horse candidate from New Hampshire. And because he's really not affiliated with the Buchanan-King wing of the party, they decide to kind of placate that wing by choosing King. So King was sort of symbolically important. He balanced the ticket in 1852 between a Northerner and a Southerner, and he also brought in all Buchanan supporters behind him. So it was a very strategic move by the Democratic Party, and it ensured a landslide victory, because the 1852 election really was a landslide for Pierce and King. Now, in the selection process, we might say that Franklin Pierce followed tradition. He wasn't active in his own nomination. He wasn't active in the selection, and he didn't even campaign. I mean, really, it was custom for the time for neither president nor vice presidential candidates to campaign. So this leads us then to Pierce's election and what happens next. Well, Buchanan actually wrote Pierce at several points to encourage him to consult with William Rufus King, because he thought it would ultimately lead to more of his sort of supporters being included in the administration. But what essentially happened was Franklin Pierce ignored King and Buchanan during the entire period leading up to his inauguration in March of 1853. And it actually had a lot to do with King's illness. Once it became known that King was ill and would need to leave the United States to seek treatment in Cuba, he effectively lost any political power he might have had. And in January of 1853, King and his entourage leaves the United States on a steamer, and they bring with them all the things they're going to need for an extended stay, furniture even, in Cuba. They arrive there in Havana, and they're transported to the town of Matanzas. And this is a town that was known for its sugar plantations. And the working theory, the most modern medicine of the day, was that the vapors produced within these processing plants or really houses would somehow alleviate his condition. And the idea was that he would sort of sit inside and breathe the vapors. It's sort of sad to think about that this is what a vice president of the United States was left to, because there was no medical cure for tuberculosis. And the thing is, I think most people recognize it was just a temporary measure. And I think that's when King himself made the decision after his famous inauguration on foreign soil that his time on Earth was nearing its end. And he himself decides to leave Cuba to return to Alabama. And he basically wants to die at home. And he sails out of Cuba, enters into the Mississippi River, and will work his way up eventually by waterway to Selma, where in just a few days after his arrival, he'll die. And his last words supposedly were, "Hush, let me pass quietly."
Oh, wow. That's very, very interesting. Now, Pierce and King, did they really know each other very well at all before he became his vice presidential candidate and before winning, obviously, the presidency and the vice presidency? Were they familiar with one another, or were they complete strangers?
Well, they may as well have been complete strangers. They had known each other during their period in the Senate. Again, this was the 1830s and until about 1841 when Pierce leaves the Senate. So they had some contact there. But the reality was, during the presidential campaign and leading up to King's departure for Cuba, they didn't exchange more than a single letter, and they didn't see each other. So the thing is, given the transportation limitations, given King's physical limitations, he basically had no relationship with Franklin Pierce. And Pierce, I think, was savvy enough to know that he didn't have to give anything to King, Buchanan, and their supporters. And it will be one of Buchanan's great frustrations after King's death that entire wing of the Democratic Party is basically dismissed. And it actually comes full circle when Buchanan is nominated and elected in 1856. He will quickly replace all the Pierce appointments with his own people. So Pierce and Buchanan were not on the friendliest of terms, and by extension, King and Pierce were really not on friendly terms either.
Interesting. So now, Thomas, to end this, coming back all full circle, we started with the relationship between Buchanan and King, and I would like us to end there. So now King obviously goes back home to Alabama, dies a couple days after his arrival there at his plantation, and is, of course, interred originally right on the property of his plantation. Now, any sort of funeral proceedings or any sort of ceremonies that took place, was James Buchanan in attendance down there in Alabama?
Well, now I'm talking to the expert, TJ, and I'm sure you'll have some wonderful images from your time there. Let me just say that the original burial ground of William Rufus King, original spot of his interment, is not open to the public, and I'm doubting you actually made your way over there. It's on private land.
Isn't it a lumber yard or something?
Well, there's an irony of irony today, TJ. That the land is owned by, get this, the Buchanan Lumber Company.
That's unbelievable.
So, but it is private property, and you cannot go on there legally without permission of the Buchanan Lumber Company, which I have not gotten in, and I actually don't know if it's allowed. It's possible, because King's Bend Plantation, as it passed hands through the years, was eventually sold, and as it's used today, it's timberland. So the site apparently was on the Selma River, overlooking the water. And the problem was that the Selma River was prone to flooding, and in fact, it caused damage to the plantation house and possibly to the King burial site. So the decision was made to reinter Vice President King to a more suitable burial ground, both in terms of access to the public in a cemetery and because of the possible risk of erosion and damage to the site on the river. And that's why he was reinterred to Live Oak Cemetery. Now, there's some kind of interesting, almost creepy stories about how they did it, because there was supposedly some resistance from the family members about this move. And so apparently it was done in the middle of the night without anyone's knowledge. He was dug up. The coffin was reinterred in what is now a very handsome mausoleum in this picturesque setting with the live oaks kind of weeping on the grounds of Live Oak Cemetery, which gives it its name. And I think it was probably the right decision for the sort of long-term preservation of King's legacy. At the same time, it is another one of these stories of presidential and vice presidential burial sites that just makes your spine tingle.
Yes, it's very, very interesting. So now, lastly, Thomas, I know there was letters, correspondence, and such between King and Buchanan that were destroyed by family members of Buchanan's. Is that correct? Or correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel in all your research, I mean, obviously one can only speculate, but do you feel that these letters and some of these correspondence were probably much more a very privately intimate type conversation between the two men? Or do you think that was the reason for the destruction of these letters and correspondence? Or do you think it was just one of these things where the people that destroyed them didn't think they would be important, so they just discarded them? What are your feelings there?
Well, it's actually one of the great myths, TJ, that Buchanan's relatives destroyed his papers. In fact, Harriet Lane Johnson was a very careful steward. We have over 60 letters from William Rufus King to James Buchanan that survives in the collections at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So we have a very rich collection of William Rufus King documents. The problem is we don't have any letters from James Buchanan to William Rufus King because of, I think, external factors. Now, it is possible that King's relatives destroyed his papers, but there again, I really doubt it. There are some surviving papers that very likely were in the King's Bend plantation in Selma that made their way over to Montgomery, and I investigated those and read those. Mm-hmm. The problem is there should be Buchanan letters, and they're not there. So I had to really look into why they weren't. And there's a couple possible explanations, both having to do, again, with Alabama's place in history and the Civil War. Alabama was insulated from the fighting. There were actually very few battles in Alabama during the Civil War because it's really the heart of the Deep South and what was the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. So when sort of the Union Army came to Alabama, it was already at the tail end of the war. But there was a Battle of Selma, a kind of little-known conflict that took place because Selma was a munitions factory, and it was sort of supplying the Confederate Army with bullets. So it was a target of strategic interest to the Union Army, and there was an army dispatched to take Selma. Now, in the process, once the Union Army took hold of the city, they occupied various houses and plantations and destroyed artifacts and other property during this raid. And it's possible, though I'm not sure, that some of Buchanan's letters were destroyed during a raid on King's Bend. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I mentioned the flooding. The Alabama River flooded so frequently that it's also possible that records were destroyed in the process. Mm-hmm. So we're not exactly sure why the letters don't survive between Buchanan and King, from Buchanan to King. But I want to say this. During my research, I did visit Alabama. I made connections with local historians there, and I met a local historian of William Rufus King who, by way of family descendants, actually has some private collections which are not in public possession, including a wonderful portrait of William Rufus King before his term as vice president that is, again, not ever been publicly displayed. And in my conversations with him, I got the sense that there may be more documents still that will surface, and hopefully soon. So I really don't know, TJ. It might be that the letters are actually out there, but that the public just hasn't seen them.
Wow, interesting. It's like the Kennedy assassination files. We're just waiting for them to be released and popped up. That's pretty interesting. Well, Thomas, this has been fascinating. I want to thank you so much. In conclusion, I just want you to know that I think I've told you this in the past, but William Rufus King's tomb down there, that mausoleum, is one of my favorites that I ever visited. There's just something very beautiful about it. So it's very interesting, and I'm glad that I got to spend some time with you today. This has been an absolute pleasure, and it always is. And I'm sure in the future you and I will be doing more things together here on my channel. But thank you again, Thomas, for your time, and we really appreciate all the information.
Well, it's great to be back with you, TJ, and I look forward to seeing it.
You too. All right, take care now, Thomas.